The Mark V tank, life inside a tank. The battlefield was permanently altered by the introduction of tank warfare. The British Mark V and German A7V, two of the first steel giants, engaged in fierce combat, their crews suffering from the oppressive heat, loud noises, and continual danger. This is the tale of the troops who fought inside these early combat robots. To the surprise and astonishment of the German soldiers, they were first used during the Battle of the Somme in September 1916. Before the war ended in November 1918, more than 2,000 of these British main battle tanks were constructed. They were a series of large, so-called land ships with a remarkably similar layout. There were 5 primary models, with the Mark V being the best throughout the war. This was created by British Royal Naval Air Service engineer Major W.G. Wilson and manufactured at the Metropolitan Carriage and Wagon Factory in Saltley and Oldbury, West Midlands, England. It was first used in July 1918. The Mark V tank was merely an upgraded variant of the Mark IV tank, not a completely new design. There were 400 of these Mark Vs produced, and they were divided into 2 versions: the female variety, which was equipped with an all-machine gun, and the male variant, which was equipped with a 6-pounder gun. Each was made in quantities of 200. The crew room. They had very little ventilation and were noisy, claustrophobic, and extremely hot inside, just like every previous tank in the series. The 8-person crew had to write notes to each other, use hand signals, and shout to communicate. Another significant design issue in the Mark V was that the new engine layout created a continuous risk of carbon monoxide poisoning throughout the tank due to poorly vented exhaust gases. It was not uncommon for crew members to pass out in the tank. The cabin of the driver. This new model's sole revolutionary and distinctive characteristic was that it was operated by a single driver via a gearbox that had 4 forward gears and 1 backward gear. In contrast, previous models required 4 gearmen, 2 for each track of the tank. Driving the tank had become very confusing due to this previously awkward design, which led to several errors and mishaps. Because the driver of the Mark V could only see through a narrow slit, the tank commander would frequently exit the vehicle and walk in front of it when the tank was not in combat, giving the driver directions and pointing out any possible dangers. The forward-firing machine gun was handled by a gunner who sat beside the driver. Showers and toilets, or the absence of them. Even though the tank was 26 feet, 8 meters long, there was just not enough room for any sort of onboard restroom or laundry facilities. The tank was already horribly overburdened with various pieces of equipment and ammunition, which made matters worse. The crew was given only a few rags and buckets for washing and other personal hygiene needs, even though missions frequently lasted for days. A crewman had to open the escape hatch and dump the contents of one of the buckets. However, these buckets of trash would have to remain inside for hours at a time during combat, adding to the hot, poorly ventilated interior's stink of perspiration and fumes. Dinner service foods like bacon and eggs may frequently be prepared on board by wrapping them in tin foil and setting them on top of a hot engine to cook slowly. But it wasn't until the British Centurion tank's boiling vessel was added 30 years later that the crucial cup of tea could be made in a British tank. As a result, the crew had to use homemade gasoline burners to boil their water outside the tank. The motor. A huge 19-liter 6-cylinder inline Ricardo gasoline engine powered the 29-ton tank. The engine generated 150 horsepower, the same amount of power as a Harley-Davidson motorcycle today. This allowed the Mark V to reach a maximum speed of 5 miles per hour, which is comparable to a person walking quickly. Tank for fuel. The tank could contain 93 gallons, 420 liters, of petrol, but its range was only 45 miles. Despite its protection, opposing heavy machine gun fire may readily breach the fuel tank. Because the tank ran on gasoline, it may blow up when struck, igniting the tank and rendering it inoperable. It was necessary to assemble specially trained salvage crews to recover the bodies of numerous personnel that were cremated in this manner from the charred hulks. The starting handle. To start the tank engine, a big starting handle that required forceful rotation with both hands was used to crank start the tank internally. using a crude signaling system consisting of levers and discs on top of the tank. The semaphore system enabled communication between tanks. Nevertheless, this system was very dependent on clear visibility. As a result, bad weather conditions like rain or fog in the morning rendered it all but worthless. Smoke from battlefields was another issue. Additionally, the tanks were equipped with wicker baskets that held carrier pigeons. These birds would be released outside the tank to fly back to base with messages affixed to their legs. The armored exterior of the Mark V was made of steel plate that was 16 millimeters thick on the front, 12 millimeters thick on the sides, and 8 millimeters, 0.31 inches, thick on the roof and rear. It could therefore take severe machine gun fire and grenade bursts on all but the tank's roof and rear, and it was completely impervious to all forms of small weapons fire. The steel plate was brittle due to its ordinary industrial grade, making it prone to splintering if it was penetrated. If this occurred, the crew compartment would be devastated by tiny, red-hot metal fragments flying everywhere. Gas masks were constantly nearby, and the crew would shield their eyes with chainmail masks that looked like they belonged in the Middle Ages. The male version was equipped with four 0.303 machine guns positioned throughout the tank, and a 6-pounder gun in each of the forward-facing sections of its sponson. There were 4 machine guns, one in the driver's cabin facing forward, one on each side of the sponson, and one at the back of the tank. The female version was identical, but machine guns were used in place of the 6-pounders. As a short-barrel variant of the British naval gun, 6-pounders avoided becoming trapped in the mud when traversing shell craters and trenches. The Hotchkiss M1909 machine guns were capable of firing up to 10 rounds per second in brief bursts. Still, their disadvantage was that, despite being smokeless, the odor of the cordite propellant used in the machine gun rounds irritated the gunner's eyes and lungs inside the small, poorly ventilated tank. Ammunition. While the thousands of ammunition for the machine guns were dispersed around the tank near the weapon ports for convenient and speedy access, the 207 rounds for the 6-pounder cannon were kept in one central location. The side sponson turrets. Since fully functional tank turrets had not yet been created, sponsons were initially employed. One was situated on each side of the Mark V tank, and each one held 2 weapons, one on the side of the sponson, which could only fire at targets to the side of the tank, and one in the front of the sponson, which had a tiny arc of fire and could only fire at targets in front of the tank. Depending on the variation, the weapon pointing forward would be either a machine gun for the female or a 6-pounder gun for the male. In both versions, the side-facing weapon was always a machine gun. The M3 Lee Grant, the American stopgap tank of World War II, was a notable exception to the trend of designers abandoning these awkward mountings in favor of more successful turreted designs after the war. Observation post. A series of observation slits were employed to provide an all-around view from an armored cabin on the tank's roof. The commander could shoot his 6-shot service revolver through the peepholes on either side if necessary. Although these tanks had a fair amount of success, they were gradually phased out of service after the war to make way for modern tanks with gun turrets, fewer crew members, and appropriate dedicated suspension, such as the Vickers Medium Mark II, which also had radios. The 1920 end of the Russian Civil War saw the use of some Mark Vs. The Red Army deployed 4 of them as dug-in defenses during the defense of Tallinn against the German invaders in August 1941, which was the final known use of them. A 7V tank cross-section, German panzers advancing across enemy territory, leaving a path of death and devastation in their wake, are among the most recognizable images from World War II. It was not a good start for German tanks during World War I. The A7V, their first attempt at a tank design, was a cumbersome metal box on tracks that were very different from the powerful tanks that were developed 25 years later. In an attempt to end the protracted standoff on the Western Front, the Entente powers introduced the first tanks in 1916. Despite its limitations, the French and British tanks' success demonstrated to the world that a new approach to combat had been adopted. As late as 1917, the German High Command was still depending on artillery, and particularly infantry, using novel stormtrooper tactics to break the impasse since they were reluctant to employ their armored vehicles. Despite all of this, Germany did have some progressive planners, and in May 1917, Joseph Bulmer's final A7V prototype was put to the test. Production started in October after some adjustments, and the first A7Vs reached the front line in March 1918. The General War Department Section 7 Transportation, or Abteilung 7 Verkehrswesen, inspired the tank's name, the A7V. Only 20 A7Vs were ultimately produced by the end of hostilities in November 1918, despite the original plan to construct 100. The A7V was the sole tank that Germany produced, despite designs for further tank variations being created. None of these reached the production line before the end of the war. The car was called the Assault Armored Motor Vehicle, or Sturmpanzerwagen. Crew quarters. Compared to its French and British rivals, the A7V's crew was significantly larger, typically consisting of 18 men. 12 or more infantrymen were needed to operate the vehicle's 6 machine guns, in addition to an officer, driver, mechanic, and mechanic signaler. 2 artillerymen were also on board to load and handle the front cannon. Mostly on the female version, they were able to fit up to 25 men in the tank at times. The A7V's interior was a straightforward open area without any partitions dividing its various elements. The officer and driver sat above the tank, looking out via a cupola while the engines were in the middle. To protect themselves from the tremendous heat produced by the engines, both of these men wore garments filled with asbestos. There were tiny openings that offered a scant vision of the outside world. As the commander reoriented himself, the tank would have to stop frequently. The remaining members of the crew were in charge of the tank's 6 machine guns and the main 57mm gun. In addition to being incredibly hot and claustrophobic, the car was also filled with gasoline odors. When not engaged in combat, crew members would frequently ride on the outside of the tank to avoid the pain. Multiple rectangular hatches along the tank's side provided access to the vehicle. Armaments. The male variation. A 7V's primary weapon was a 57mm field cannon mounted on a bow. About 180 rounds, split between regular, canister, and high-explosive bombs, made up a typical ordnance load. 6 Maxim MG 087.92 by 57mm machine guns were positioned around the perimeter of the hull, 2 on each side and 2 at the back. About 50 to 60 belts of machine gun ammo, each holding 250 rounds, would be carried by each tank. This was the standard weapon. However, it may be modified according to the situation. For instance, a pair of Maxim machine guns was used in place of the 57mm gun to transform one tank into a feminine or all-machine gun variation. Since German engineers had not yet considered the concept of a revolving turret, each weapon was fixed in place. Consequently, every component, particularly the bow-mounted field gun, was limited by a firing arc. The entire tank had to be moved around to use this armament, which was a laborious and slow procedure. Armor. The A7V's armor was 20 millimeters thick at the sides and about 30 millimeters thick at the front. The weakest armor, which was just over 10 millimeters thick and thin enough for fragmentation bombs to pass through, was found on the tank's top and underside. Additionally, the metal was simply ordinary steel, which was brittle. The personnel inside would be pelted with metal shards, even if an enemy fire hit was deflected. Names and artwork. The new team gave each A7V a special name and christened it. Some were called after mythological figures like Siegfried, Hercules, and Wotan, while others were given feminine names like Gretchen or Lottie. Number 506, Mephisto, is the only surviving A7V. By the way, the number 503 tank was called Faust. The crews would paint the vehicle with artwork before going into war. A white rhomboid that resembled a British tank in profile was held by a red demon in Mephisto. A black and white crosspity, or German cross, would be painted over the skull and crossbones that were also painted on the bow of several of the tanks. A crowned British lion with its paw over an A7V would be painted on Mephisto after it was captured. The engine, the A7V, was driven by 2 4-cylinder Daimler-Benz petrol engines in the middle of the car, which produced 200 horsepower between them. Performance. Since no single engine was big enough to power what would fit in the tank's hull's constrained space, two engines were used. On roads, these drove the tank at around 9 miles per hour. On rough ground, this was lowered to about 3 miles per hour. The A7V increased its traction by riding on caterpillar tracks, just like its peers. The tank's armored coating, which concealed the tracks and lessened their susceptibility to hostile fire, was one advantage over the Entente designs. Tank for fuel. The tank could hold 500 liters or 132 gallons of fuel. The A7V's range on level roads was restricted to 60 kilometers or 37.3 miles due to the engine's high fuel consumption. Measurements. The dimensions of the A7V were 3.3 meters in height, 3.1 meters in width, and 7.34 meters, 24 feet, in length. The production procedure, which involved hand-making each tank without any standards, resulted in minor variations between each vehicle, causing them to weigh between 30 and 33 tons. Although it could move on its own, the boxy shape was reminiscent of an armored train car. The suspension and chassis, the Holt tractor chassis, served as the basis for the A7V's design, which had a vertical spring suspension. The tank could only operate on roads and level terrain because of its extremely low ground clearance, caused by the vehicle's enormous weight. The ride was rough, despite the suspension, and the tank's roof had ropes that the crew could grip onto to help them stay upright when crossing rough terrain. A 7V in operation. There was little use of the A7V during the conflict. The tanks were used for the first time in the spring offensive at St. Quentin in March 1918. The surviving A7Vs assisted in fending off a British counterattack, but two of the vehicles failed before the battle began. 3 A7Vs were supporting an infantry attack at the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux on April 24, 1918, when they came across 3 British Mark V tanks. 2 female versions with machine guns only, and a male version with 2 6-pounder cannons. The British female tanks retreated from the battle because their machine guns were completely useless against the A7V. The male tank stayed behind and hit an A7V multiple times, rendering the vehicle inoperable and forcing its occupants to flee. This was the outcome of the world's first tank duel. Mephisto got stuck in a shell crater during this battle and was unable to escape. The tank was eventually recovered by the British after the crew abandoned it. Eventually, it would be shipped to Australia, where it remains today as a museum exhibit and prize. The A7V was taken out of active duty by the German High Command because of its subpar performance at Villers-Bretonneux, and orders for an additional 100 vehicles were cancelled. Although seized British and French tanks would make up the majority of Germany's armored forces, the remaining vehicles would see limited use throughout the remaining months of the war. The majority of the remaining tanks were demolished after the war. Despite its lackluster performance, the A7V would not be Germany's final tank. The Great War's lessons would be incorporated into later German tank designs, producing some of the most well-known and potent tanks ever constructed. We are truly grateful that you followed our video through to the very end. Subscribe to our channel if you have a strong interest in history and would like to see more engaging and educational videos. We'll keep providing you with more incredible historical events and tales.